Hi, I'm Joseph.
And I'm Grace.
How are you doing today?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm great.
Getting ready for finals?
Absolutely.
Fair enough.
So, today we're going to be talking about Ode to Pork, which is written by Kevin Young.
Yes. And throughout the podcast, we're going to discuss the history of Kevin Young, the historical context of Ode to Pork. We're going to discuss a literary criticism of Ode to Pork and similar poems. We're going to give our opinion on that literary criticism and then dive into what our opinions of the poem are as well.
All right.
And now we're just going to read the poem. That way you listeners have an idea of what we're discussing today. So, this is the poem, Ode to Pork. I wouldn't be here without you. Without you, I'd be umpteen pounds lighter and a lot less alive. You stuck round my ribs even when I treated you like a dog. Dirty. I dare not eat. I know you're the blues because loving you may kill me. But still you rock me down slow as hammocks on the stove. Any way you come, fried, cubed, burnt, to within 1 inch of your life I love. Babe, I revere your every nickname. Bacon, chitlin, cracklin, sin. Some call you murder, shame's stepsister, and then dress you up and declare you white and healthy. But you always come back, sauced, to me. Adam himself gave up a rib to see yours. Piled pink beside him, your heaven is the only one worth wanting. You keep me all night cursing your 4-letter name. The next, begging for you again. Okay.
All right. And then a little outlook on Kevin Young's life, starting out a little young. He was born in 1970 in the area of Lincoln, Nebraska, and started his poetry journey very young. He graduated with a bachelor's degree from Harvard. Ode to Pork is one of his most unknown poems, but was published in one of his earlier books. And he's been nominated for awards for his other winnings. He leads a poetry podcast and edits the poetry section of The New Yorker. And he has a total of 17 books so far and is still writing many more.
Mm-hmm. And I also think we found out that Ode to Pork was actually released in a book of poems called Dear Darkness.
Yes.
Dear Darkness, yes. I think that's pretty awesome that he graduated from Harvard.
Oh, yeah.
I feel like I don't know, I don't hear of a lot of people, graduating from Harvard. That's a big deal. That's good.
I don't hear a lot of poets graduating from Harvard.
That too. But you know what? The more you know. And some things that kind of identify or make Kevin Young's work a little bit different than other poets or other writers. He successfully finds ways to put his imagination throughout each of his poems, much like what we just read. I mean, was he really talking about pork? Was he, discussing something else? But just the way that he described different forms of pork, the way that he explained the love-hate relationship that he has with pork, I thought was really interesting, and how he, kind of twisted his imagination into that. What do you think?
I think his twist on pork is really just an interesting take, because of all the foods that you could pick to write an ode for, I felt like pork just kind of, it differentiates from, chicken or a steak, for the way that he brings up the way that pork can be cooked continuously, and how it just keeps on coming back to him like it's a sin that he just can't get rid of.
Mm-hmm. Which kind of leads us into our next section, the historical context of Ode to Pork.
So at the time of its release, which was 2010, around this time, the beginning of Instagram was started. Lady Gaga wore a meat dress to the Met Gala. 50 Shades of Grey was released. Harry Potter decided to come to an end, and the release of Just the Way You Are by Bruno Mars came out prior to this book.
Well, those things seem kind of silly when talking about our poem, but that is kind of the culture of that time that we lived in, the beginning of Instagram, the beginning of some of those social media platforms, and that outward expression of emotion from influencers like Lady Gaga, showing that there are different types of way to kind of show your imagination and show your passion for different things through different outlets, much like what Kevin does in his work, I would say.
Yeah. I decided to look further into the significance of pork in African American culture, and I found out that pork does have a significant history in, like, culture for them.
Mm-hmm.
It's because of dietary restrictions set during the time of enslavement, because they weren't able to access as much protein, and so it was what they had, and it was part of their restrictions.
Mm-hmm. And I also, kind of hearing you talk about that in the poem when it talks about Adam giving up his rib and everything like that, there are even some religious groups, that aren't allowed to indulge or endeavor themselves into pork or, whatever word I'm trying to use there. But there are different, I went to high school with a couple of people who couldn't eat pork due to their religious beliefs, so it's interesting to see that perspective of Kevin writing, if we don't dive into the poem completely yet.
Yeah.
Him writing a poem about a meat, a food. It's a little interesting for sure. So then, it kind of also makes me ask, okay, well then what is an ode? Because we keep saying, oh, he's writing an ode about this, whatever. An ode is it's a lyrical poem that addresses a specific topic, but more importantly, showing a love or an obsession with a certain topic. Kevin Young also has other odes. I'm pretty sure one is Ode to Boudin, which is it's another food, which we'll kind of dive into more later as well. And another thing to kind of ask is, what's the contrast with this poem and other traditional poems like we were talking about before? What makes Kevin Young a little bit different than some of the other people in his field? I would say that traditional poems aren't typically set on a cultural background in the same regards as this ode is. Obviously, there's historical and cultural context to a majority of the poems that we've read in Mr. Mcquillen's class and everything like that. But I just feel like this one's a little bit more different.
Yeah.
Would you agree?
Yeah, no, I totally agree on that. I feel like some other poems that we read didn't have, the same sense of background to it. This one has a deeper background than just pork. It has a cultural history, and it has even further history alongside that we'll talk about later.
Right. And that honestly leads into our literary criticism pretty well. So trying to find a literary criticism for this poem was pretty difficult, but luckily with the help of the USCB library, we were able to find a dissertation or a thesis submission submitted by Jacob Thomas Shepers. And this was a submission to the University of Buffalo in 2014. So I'm just going to go into detail a little bit about that, if that's okay. So kind of the summary of this is Jacob Thomas Shepers brings up many good points in his thesis submission to the University of Buffalo in 2014. In summary of Chapter 1 of his discussions, he focuses heavily on the poems about food from Kevin Young. So not necessarily about Ode to Pork just by itself, but Ode to Boudin, like I had mentioned before. He brings up the point that a lot of other critics draw a lot of similarities to somewhat wry and mundane odes written by other people and to Pablo Neruda. And he thinks that these odes are much more than just allusions to previous people or previous literary ancestors such as Pablo Neruda. So a lot of critics said that, Kevin Young is just writing like these other ancestors that have written odes and poems similar to this, but the person, Mr. Shepers here, that was submitting his thesis, thought that it was going to be a little bit different and had some other opinions. Instead, Jacob believed that these poems allow Kevin Young to compensate for the grief of losing his father and his grandparents. At the time that we read this poem, I had no idea that his father and his grandparents were deceased. I had no idea about that. So that was really interesting to figure out. And kind of as talked about before during this episode of the podcast, We know that there is that heritage connection to African American people and pork, which Kevin Young directs his attention to, obviously, here in the poem Ode to Pork. Jacob brings up that in these odes, Kevin Young could quite literally be turning these foods and these objects into comfort food and comfort objects. I mean, you have a comfort food, I'm sure. What's your comfort food?
My comfort food is, I don't know, depends on, like, the time of day.
Okay.
But a lot of the time, it'll either be, like, ice cream or bagels.
Mm-hmm. See, I really like mac and cheese as a comfort food. And, like, when I was reading about this in his article, I was like, okay, let me put myself in their shoes. It was kind of odd, like, if I wrote a poem about mac and cheese, not only is it physically a comfort food, but now I'm kind of, malling it into something else.
Yeah.
For it to be a different type of comfort, in a way. And then, yeah, you can get that part right there.
So, the common theme throughout this whole thing, after finding out about the loss of his grandparents and his dad, I came to the conclusion the theme was of loss. Claiming that it was a way to express grief and losing his grandparents and the nourishment of his youth could really just be, like, the leading theme in it.
Mm-hmm.
And, there's some key points to that, bringing up how the poem is an ode based on grief and nourishment creates a good point in the poem, providing a new look on it that I didn't see prior. I was just constantly asking, what is pork supposed to be, instead of just, like, a food, because it just didn't seem like it was meant as a food type of sense.
Mm-hmm. But maybe now it is, because he is trying to kind of make that comfort item for himself.
Yeah, he's finding comfort in pork.
Mm-hmm.
And so now I see it more as, like, a comfort food, or, like, a way that he finds it as comfort.
Mm-hmm.
The structure of the poem, though, is definitely set apart from poems I typically hear or see in books or in, school assignments. This type of structure has, like, a creative twist on it that keeps you locked in the message being conveyed throughout the whole life. And, my original thought about the whole poem was his romantic and sexual life, because he's talking about pork being sauced up, coming back to him all the time.
Right.
And coming in different shapes. And so at that moment, I didn't really know what I was supposed to think about it. And it was really just the opposite of what I was truly thinking.
Okay, gotcha. So I guess kind of going more into it, kind of what we thought about the criticism. I think the things that surprised us most when we were discussing it earlier is when we first read it over, we had no idea that Kevin Young had lost his father and his grandparents. I would say that we weren't super on board with what this scholar had to say, Mr. Sheppers, just because, as we talked about in class multiple times, it is important to kind of disassociate the author from the work.
Yeah.
And I think this scholar's kind of doing the complete opposite of that, because what are we getting from the poem if we didn't have that context is something completely different than what we're getting from the poem with that context.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I would argue and say that the scholar read too much into Kevin Young's life, especially because this isn't the only ode that he's written about food. Like, maybe it's just a thing that he has about, writing odes to certain foods, but if we're going he's using it as a grief to compensate for his grief, does he really have that many comfort objects or materials, or, what does that look like? Like, that kind of set me aside. What about you?
I mean, that definitely sets me aside, but also I feel like sometimes comfort food seems though I have, like, way more than what I said.
Yeah.
I feel like it's understandable to have comfort foods for different situations in your life.
Oh, that's a good point. So maybe he's dealing with different things and these odes are coming out at different points in his life.
Yeah. For me,
Okay.
I find comfort in ice cream whenever I lose somebody. Or if I lose something that was, like, really dear to me. Then I'm like, I'm just picking up the pint.
Picking up the pint. Yeah, right.
And I just, like, you know, but
there's different things for different situations.
Yeah, because, like, stress food.
Okay.
You know, it could look like a bag of French fries.
I really did not think of it that way. I like where you're going with that. So would you say that this changed or, you know, deepened your understanding of the poem at all?
I would say it definitely changed my understanding of the poem because I felt like I knew a lot about what was going on. But now I feel like there's so much more to expand on off of Ode to Pork than there was before.
Okay, awesome. And so I guess I would say that it didn't really change or deepen my understanding. It gave me a different perspective to kind of keep on the back burner there. But I don't think I really agree with it yet. I really like what you have to say. I like that a lot, actually. I just still think it's a little ridiculous that he is digging so much into Kevin Young's life. And, you know, kind of like, maybe that's some more research that I need to do is, okay, where do these things line up? When did his father pass away? When did his grandparents pass away in relation to the release date of some of these odes?
Yeah.
So I guess now moving into our personal opinions of the poem, some things that I liked was when we were talking about this in class, getting to hear everyone else's different ideas and opinions as to what the poem meant.
Yeah.
And just kind of the more that I read the poem, I really started to see the connection that pork could be a metaphor for women. Just kind of knowing his works, though, dismayed that idea a little bit. Because some of the odes that he would write, they're about different food items, so maybe it's not about a woman, but just the way that, you know, he uses the word babe, the way that he, like, does the different shapes, the different names, stuff like that, like, just maybe that objectification. But the more research we did into this project, I'm not sure if that's kind of my final opinion on the poem. I'm sure it will never be final. And then some things that I didn't like was just the usage of the word babe. Like, every time I would read it, it was just a little unsettling. And it does connect to pork. Like, I've heard people, I grew up raising pigs, and I would hear people call the pigs babe sometimes. I just thought it was a little unsettling, especially with that idea I had in my head of it being about women.
Yeah.
And then some personal connections. I might get a little deep here, I'm sorry. But in the poem, he's kind of expressing how he has this unhealthy attachment to something that is hurting him. I would say that I have that connection with some things in my life as well. Maybe it's my phone, or, you know, maybe it's certain relationships that I'm holding on to. But just like Kevin Young, he sees in other ways why his attachment to pork is a good thing. Let's go with my phone, for example. That's the way that I keep in touch with my family, being so far away from home. Yeah. So having that connection with something unhealthy to me, but also seeing it from the other perspective of it being good for me as well. And then for the theme, I thought it was really focusing a lot on the love-hate relationship with things that society deems unhealthy, such as unhealthy friendships, unhealthy relationships, phones, food, whatever. So that's my personal opinion.
I don't know, after you say something about his unhealthy obsession, I can't help but think about, like, how this could tie in, because if this was, like, his genuine, like, obsession with pork, maybe this could be like a My Strange Addiction episode or something, you know?
That's true. There are some weird ones on there for sure.
I mean, potentially at the time that was probably really at large too, that show.
Oh, yeah. It was like TLC, like that culture of like expressing things that you might unhealthily like be attached to, for sure.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay. Yeah.
And it just like, it seems like it would fit.
Yeah.
Story. Anyways, the things that I really enjoyed about the progression of pork is like continuously throwing the progression of it in the story. Like, it started out as just like, oh, look, it's pork. But then it turns into this, like, unhealthy obsession. It just, like, it grows throughout the poem.
Of, like, different ways you can have it and, like, okay.
Yeah, different ways it's cooked. The poem questions, like, it creates questions for me about, like, how in the world is pork sauced up all the time? And what is it sauced up for? Like, trying to figure out what pork is potentially like.
Symbolizing.
Yeah.
Okay.
Just creates like a big mystery for me.
So would you say that what you liked about the poem was that it like had you asking a bunch of questions?
Yeah, it kept me engaged the whole time. I was like, I want to know what the heck pork
Maybe we
is
just
to
need to
him.
go meet Kevin Young.
Yeah,
Be like, hey yo dude, what is up with this poem?
like I wanna ask him flat out, what's pork?
What's pork?
You know? And just
Right. Okay.
Maybe I'll share a pork dinner with him or something. I don't know.
Okay.
One thing I didn't like though is like the constant mention of the word pork. Like I feel like he could have just been like, the pork is cubed, like sauced up. Like he could have just kept it going from pork because we already had the context.
We already knew that it was pork.
Yeah, we knew it was pork.
Okay,
but he was just like pork.
But maybe he did that on purpose. Maybe that's like the reiteration of it to make sure, like, that idea is in your head. Okay, I get that.
For personal connections, I feel like I'm not able to go as deep as you.
It's okay.
Because after learning that this was written after a meat dress was worn, I thought maybe it could tie into the fact that he thought a meat dress was like, I feel like it could have tied into the poem a lot.
Like you're reading into the Lady Gaga meat dress at the Met Gala, yeah.
Like a meat dress was worn. All of a sudden there's a whole poem written about meat.
But as we were talking about before, like maybe it has to do with like maybe not looking at it as like surface level, but just being able to outwardly express your emotions, which Kevin Young does a little bit more than some other poets.
Yeah.
Okay.
And for the theme that I believe it is, it's recognizing that sometimes the bad things can be so good and sweet. And I feel like that's just like a short, simple way to say like, it's like a guilty pleasure.
Okay. I like the guilty pleasure route. That's good. All right. Well, I think that's all that we really had to say during the podcast here. I would say that we encourage you guys to go read it for yourself and maybe read some of the other odes that Kevin has made about different types of food as well. What are your final remarks?
Well, I say like it's definitely an interesting poem to read. And it's one that I would definitely read again in the future. It just seems like something that my perspective will change every time I read it because the more I learn, the more I like realize in it.
Yeah, of course.
And he's one of the few poets that we've studied in a class that isn't dead yet.
That's true. There is a chance to still meet him and ask him.
Yeah, there's
what's going on.
I could write a letter.
We could write an ode.
Yeah, we could write an ode.
Ode to Kevin Young.
Yeah.
Ode to Kevin Young.
Just definitely thinking of like taking inspiration from his poem now and writing like an ode to Kraft mac and cheese.
Ode to ice cream?
I don't know. Maybe.
All right. Well, thank you guys for listening. We hope that you enjoyed.
All right. Well, we'll see you again later.
Bye.